Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We're going to be talking about overseeing both executive and board compensation. And joining me, who knows quite a bit about this topic, is Jim Curtis, who's the chair of Human Resource and Compensation Committee for Cameco Corporation. Jim, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here, TK.
So, you've been in your position for quite a while, so it makes you qualified to talk about this, but share with us the changes that you've seen as chair, say, over the last 10 years, and certainly with the influence of more transparency requested from shareholders.
Well, there's certainly been a number of changes over that period of time. I've chaired a compensation committee for 10 or 12 years at Cameco, and the significant changes that have occurred, I think, are probably four that I would highlight. One, there's much more emphasis on transparency today, not just in the context of say on pay, but shareholders want to know how you approach compensation issues. I will say that perhaps unlike the audit committee today, perhaps we're in the same position that they were in post Sarbanes-Oxley, where there's a lot of attention, a lot of focus. Comp issues involve a lot of judgment, and everybody wants to express a view on that in one way or the other. So there's a lot more visibility on comp issues today, a lot more judgment that goes into it. Secondly, I think there's a lot more emphasis on transparency in the CD&A, the compensation disclosure and analysis that is in every proxy statement. People want to understand how pay for performance is approached. They want to see how you're compensating your executive team, particularly your CEO, and there's a real emphasis on trying to explain that in a plain English way. That leads to the third point, the linkage between say on pay, compensation and performance is really something that has driven the process now and is important to explain in the context of your interactions with shareholders and with your compensation disclosure and analysis. And then I think the final point that I would make is that in terms of external visibility, ISS and Glass Lewis play an important role. They're not in the front seat driving the car with you. They shouldn't really be a backseat driver either. But there are red flags that we have all come to learn about over the years that are things that, as we explained in our CD&A at Cameco, we just don't do. Things like repricing options, red flags of that nature where you ought to outline in the interest of disclosure things that you will not do, but also explain what your compensation philosophy is and what your principles are. A lot more emphasis on explaining that in the CD&A. So I think those are probably the highlights of the differences that we've seen.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you on that last point. There are cases certainly where we've seen ISS, a Glass Lewis, vote against something that the company was still successful. But you don't want to put yourself in a position to purposely sort of flip those red flags because no board needs the attention, if they don't have to have it.
Yeah, we've been fortunate in Canada, and we are a Canadian-based company, to have good success on say and pay. We do it annually, and we've had very positive results. There are challenges that we have as a mining company. We mine uranium largely in Canada, and for us, to give you an example, about 70 to 80% of our stock price is correlated to the spot market. So TSR, total shareholder return as a metric, is a difficult challenge for us because it's not a metric that management can really manage like they can other metrics. I'm a big believer that what you measure is what you get, and so you have to have metrics that explain to management you can influence this, whether it's safety, health, and environment, a very important metric for mining companies, or other metrics like that. Management has to believe at the beginning of the year, whether it's on a short-term or a long-term incentive program, that they can do something to achieve those objectives. For a company like Cameco, TSR which does get a lot of emphasis from ISS and Glass Lewis, is really not a metric that makes as much sense as some of the other internal metrics that we use.
Yeah, one of the things that is a natural extension of the 4 points you made is the requirement for boards to be more active in shareholder engagement. We know that this isn't going away. This is something that all investors, whether it's BlackRock or CalPERS or Vanguard, all of them are interested in doing more shareholder engagement. It's interesting that it's my belief that the committee that's first going to be required to make sure that they step up is the comp committee, and there's an obvious reason for that. You don't want to send out your CEO out talking about his or her own pay. So that puts pressure on the compensation chair that they better have some communication skills, because I have a feeling they're going to be the first group in the bucket to do that. So tell me about how you feel about shareholder engagement and then how you approach it.
Well, you're exactly right. It is probably the one area where it's difficult to send out the management team because there is a self-interest in the compensation scheme. And what the shareholders really want to hear is not from management in terms of rationalizing the approach to compensation, but from the compensation committee chair or members of the compensation committee, or a chair of the board, for example, who in our case is an ex officio member of the comp committee, to go out and talk with them about how you approach compensation, how you link compensation to your strategic plan, which is an important consideration as well. And we've actually been out and talked to shareholders or shareholder groups that represent shareholders for exactly that reason. They want to have clarity about how you're approaching comp. They'd rather hear from the comp committee chair or the comp committee itself, largely represented by the comp committee chair, on how you're approaching those issues. And so we've seen that already. You describe it as being in the barrel. It's a little bit of that because there's quite a bit of preparation that's entailed. You don't want to disclose anything that has not been publicly disclosed under Reg FD, so there is that issue as well.
Well, my last question for you makes perfect sense, because we're both here for the Equilars Compensation Committee Forum, and that's why we're doing the special edition of Inside America's Boardroom. But specifically, your topic in that was board compensation and linking that to shareholders' interests. Well, shareholders' interest is a tough issue because we know they're all unique. Everybody, some have single interests, some have general interests, so it makes it difficult to tie board compensation specifically to shareholders' interests. But there is the concern of, is it fair? And how do you look, in the end, how do you handle board compensation?
It's a unique challenge because this is the one area where the board is setting its own pay. And it leads to, in some cases, the plaintiffs' bar and Citrix and Goldman coming in and challenging how that process works. So there's a level of legal visibility that this is now getting. I would say three things. One, you need to be transparent about how you do it. Number two, you need to use your compensation committee consultant to go out and do a survey on your peer group approach to compensation or your broader industry group so that you have a rational basis for saying this is how we set our own comp. And then ultimately you need to consider that the directors need to be invested in the company, not through stock options, which we moved away from, but through a substantial equity component. The minimal commitment, in my view, is the share ownership guideline that every board should have for its individual directors. That's a minimum commitment you ought to make, but there ought to be a substantial commitment to the company through equity, a portion of the director comp. Cash component as well is oftentimes something that we see, but that sort of approach where you try to establish a rational basis through your comp committee consultant reaching out to peer groups or your industry group and having a basis for that is, in my view, the way you have to approach this. I'm not sure that's going to head off the lawsuits that are pending and that will be brought in this area, but it's certainly an area that's gotten a lot more visibility.
Well, it's a sense of reasonableness, and certainly we've seen that from the Delaware Court of Chancery. You know, if somebody is reasonable in their judgment, it's when you go outside reasonableness that it seems like you have a problem. But Jim, knowing you, I'm not worried about any of your companies in the sense of reasonableness, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us on the show today.
Thank you, TK.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. Hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.